This is Cognitive Dissonance. Every episode, we blast anyone who gets in our way. We bring critical thinking, skepticism, and irreverence to any topic that makes the news, makes it big, or makes us mad. It's skeptical, it's political, and there is no welcome mat. This is episode 22 of Cognitive Dissonance. I know we've got a bunch of new listeners. Some of them have sent us emails griping at us, so we're glad to have you, glad to have your gripes. And this is going to be a very interesting episode. We also have an interview and a story that we're discussing with former congressman from Maine, Sean Faircloth, who is now on the Richard Dawkins Foundation. Sean has written a book, Attack of the Theocrats. We're going to interview him a little later on in the show. The first article that we want to discuss is from the Friendly Atheist blog, and this regards some new research. This research is sort of interesting. This is research that plays off of the conjunction fallacy, which I'll just describe very briefly. It's a way to phrase a question to expose a prejudice. And they phrase a certain question. They describe a gentleman named Richard in the question. Richard's kind of a dick, actually.
He is a total cock, that Richard.
Richard smashes somebody's car, that steals a wallet, all in the same day. It's a busy day for Richard. And they then phrase a question that exposes a bias. When they phrase the question, how likely do you think that Richard is? And then, the questions expose your bias to whether you think that he is a Christian, a Muslim, a rapist, or an atheist. And by a wide margin, people choose atheist. And I think, Sean, that this dovetails nicely into some of the things that you discuss in your book. Why do you think that people are so willing to believe that somebody who's obviously committing these immoral acts is more likely to be an atheist than a Christian, a Muslim, even a rapist?
Well, Joseph Stalin was one really ugly guy. He had a bad mustache, and he killed a lot of people. I think that a lot of it has to do with what people perceive as godless communism from the 1950s. But yet, when you get down to what does that word actually mean? And this is where I'm very optimistic. Well, I'm very optimistic on several levels, but I'm very optimistic about what really is at play here, because I think when you get down to what the word actually means, just like what the word agnostic actually means, that millions upon millions of people, including ones who would probably answer the question that it's probably most likely the atheist. In other words, I think there are people who are themselves atheists who would be prejudiced against atheists because of the whole overlay, the cultural overlay that exists in relationship to that word. I have this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, who I'd argue is probably, in my view, maybe the greatest woman in history, but certainly someone who, even if you don't agree with her, widely admired human being, certainly in American history. And she, that old "This I Believe" thing that was, they recently started it again on NPR, but it was back in the 50s. They had "This I Believe."
Oh,
she did one, and in one of these "This I Believes," she basically says, this is after FDR has been dead a while, but she basically says, yeah, he and I talked about it, and he kind of said, well, implicitly, just for cultural reasons, maybe the kids should go to church, but we're not really sure. Basically, she was saying in a national radio broadcast that at a minimum, the way she was phrasing it, that she was agnostic. This is the first lady, probably the most prominent first lady in American history, wife of what some would say was the greatest president of the 20th century. And she openly said this kind of thing. She didn't use words like atheist or agnostic or anything like that. She just kind of said, well, do I really have doubts about these ultimate questions? Yes, I do, but you just got to try your best in life. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what she said. Wow. And I think there are millions upon millions of people today who basically think like that. But when you raise that red flag of the word atheist, well, got her head run the other direction, or all those types of biases, which is something I hope to address in my book, because when you get to specifics of what people really do, ironically enough, I am very proud of my work because my work is about being moral. I really believe it. And my work is based on a humanist, agnostic, atheist perspective. And it's ironic, but that's what I think is really true. And so we need to more tout what our positions are. And, oh, by the way, they're deeply moral.
It's interesting because in your work, according to this survey, you would probably have a better day at the office if you were a guy who was informing people on the block that a sexual predator was next door.
It is remarkable what you're talking about, but I do think it has to do with the anti-communist era significantly. And there is a cultural overlay. There's a couple thousand years head start here, where oftentimes I'll see people, they have a cross, on a necklace. And what is it they're saying with that cross culturally? Really, they're saying, I'm a good person. It's my label. I've just labeled myself publicly. I'm a good person because I have this label on me. I mean, maybe that's not what Madonna meant when she had it, but probably was saying something entirely different. But that in general, it's this label. And when you're taught this label from your little childhood, that oftentimes in our culture, it's the cross, I'm a good person. And when you take what in some ways is the polar opposite of that, it takes a lot of getting over, especially when you've got theoretically Joseph Stalin or Mao hanging around your neck as well.
So to some degree, it's the label, it's the word, it's the terminology atheist. Do you think if this was phrased secular, do you think this would have come out differently?
Oh yeah, I in my book, I have a section where I create a poll. I mean, I'm a 10-year politician, and I've dealt a lot looking at polls and poll results. And even in the polls that have been done, there were some decent polls on this topic. But even then, I think there's a bias. There's a really good book out not too long ago called American Grace. But even in that book, which is reasonably objective and a reasonably good history of sort of theological and religious viewpoints in America over the last, well, really since 1960, since the Kennedy election, they still have this little implicit bias. They call it like extreme. They use the word extreme, which of course, you're not extreme. I know I'm not extreme. It's the other guy. That other guy's extreme. But they use that phrasing a couple times to refer to atheism or non-theism. And I'm thinking, Warren Buffett, non-believer, whatever you call Warren Buffett, not extreme. Bill Gates, not a believer, not extreme. But yet, even with these academics. But meanwhile, in my book, I create a poll. I'm not saying it's the best crafted poll, but I go through a series of questions. And the point of it is I believe that if not necessarily my poll, but a similar type of poll were conducted, you'd find a much higher number than even we think exists of non-believers. Because I think it's more easing people into the hot bath. That when you really go through and say to people, reassuring kind of questions, because I think most Americans, for example, if you start out with the religious right, the majority, solid majority of Americans are annoyed by, threatened by, don't like the religious right.
Rightfully so.
And you go through those series of questions, and then you start throwing in some other questions like really, to yourself, do you ever sometimes question whether there's a devil, an actual devil? And I bet you a lot of people, really, if you ask them at the bar, even ones who say they're religious, is there an actual devil? No, they at least got doubts. And then you ease people into some of these other questions, and I think ultimately it's a far higher number, a far higher percentage of Americans who have our viewpoint. It's just allowing them the thinking time and the comfort level to admit what they really think.
So do you think, no, I guess when I saw this, the first thing I thought is, okay, so here we've got Christian. Clearly, we're in a country which has a strong Christian majority. So that number I expected it to be lower. Muslim. One of the things that was interesting about this article is it exposes this idea that religious people from religion A, be it Christian or Muslim or what have you, now they will trust a person of a religion that is not their religion, much more than they would trust somebody of no religion. And I thought it was interesting that this article chose, or this study rather, chose rapist as the obviously immoral, rather than a person who commits one of these actual acts. So like Richard in this study, right, this fictional Richard crashes into a van. He commits a little insurance fraud. He finds a wallet. He takes the money, throws the wallet in the trash can. Now, those are fundamentally acts of theft. And And rather than juxtaposing this with thief, they choose a violent sexual criminal, the rapist, to juxtapose against. I wonder if that even is an example of this sort of. Now, you mentioned this other book that uses extreme in conjunction with atheism. I wonder if choosing rapist is an example of that same thing. Like, well, we have to have something to juxtapose against the atheist, right? So let's choose a rapist, not a thief, not a burglar, right? We're going to choose rapist. We're going to, like, somebody's sitting there, you know, pondering what other character in American society is so reviled? And in formulating the question, again, it feels to me like they expose this tremendous bias to say, like, well, the only thing I can I'm surprised it's not like pedophile or like, you know, mass murderer. It's because it's damn close. It's right fucking there with rapist. And I wonder if a lot of the problems that we have in these polls that you describe aren't part and parcel of a problem with being able to even form reasonable questions about people who don't believe in a way that doesn't have this extreme fucking snowboarding challenge associated with it.
Well, you're exactly right. And then on top of that, it's a schizophrenic society, because how many times, I know I've seen it, where and this could go in either gender. Let's say Angelina Jolie, we guys vote yes, or women will talk about Brad Pitt, they vote yes. They're both atheists, and they both like. I mean, you should like Brad Pitt. He's a good guy. He goes down to New Orleans all the time and helps with the people who got hurt by the flood. Everybody speaks kindly of him, and they should. He's an out-and-out atheist, but yet widely admired by our fellow Americans, and should be. So it's like people, I think what it is if you start to label yourself or talk about yourself institutionally or organizationally somehow as atheist, people don't know what humanist is, or most people at the bar don't, that then it's bad. But if you just shut up about it, then it's okay. I think that's sort of the line that's been drawn. Whereas, you know, as we saw just, you know, the night before this was recorded, the folks in the Republican primary in Iowa are allowed completely to go out and beat their chest about how not just religious they are, but Christian religious they are, and be extremely overt about that, with the implicit message that if you're not one of us, apparently the fundamentalist one of us, so sorry Jews, sorry Muslims, sorry agnostics, sorry atheists, you're allowed to be exclusionary when it comes to that. But if you simply say we should be inclusionary about people of non-belief, then you're not allowed to say that, despite some of those popular and admired people in our society being non-believers. And
some of the most attractive. I mean, let's just throw that out there. you got Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. There's not a lot of people who are like, no.
We need to say anything more.
So today we're interviewing Sean Faircloth about his book, Attack of the Theocrats. Sean is a Maine attorney and politician. He served 5 terms in the Maine legislature. In 2009, he became the executive director of the Secular Coalition for America, advocating for a separation of church and state and for greater acceptance of non-theistic viewpoints in American life. In 2011, he became the director of strategy and policy for the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, and will be an opening speaker for the Dawkins book tour. His first book has been published by Pitchstone Press. It's called Attack of the Theocrats, How the Religious Right Harms Us All and What We Can Do About It. And it's available on Amazon now. So, Sean, Tom and I have read your book. I think both of us are pretty impressed with the layout of this book. It really does It really brings forward something I think that is really useful, and it's showing this theocratic America that could be on the rise, and it gives us a plan of action. But in one of these chapters, you talk about the fundamentalist 50, and there's 50 different theocrats, as you call them. if you had to choose one of those theocrats, which one you think is the one that you would warn the audience about? Would you would say, hey, everybody, you really need to pay attention to this particular politician?
Hey, you can't pick just one.
That's the Lay's potato chips of crazy.
Exactly. That's a Lay's potato chip, heresy. I'm not allowed to do that.
Can't take this one.
The point of the Fundamentalist 50, if I can just step back in it for a second, is frankly, it could have been the Fundamentalist 100. I just took 50 that were just the greatest hits, if you will, of some of the more colorful statements from members of Congress. And one little point I'd add to something you said is you said the threat, or I forget your exact phrasing, of theocracy. And I'm not saying we live in a theocracy now, but I want your listeners to know, and this is what I document in my book, both with the Fundamentalist 50 and with the laws that are on the books in Chapter 3, is that fundamentalism and theocracy have already risen. What I mean to say is I'm the first to agree the United States of America is not a theocracy today. And we look at it in terms of the threat of, say, a Rick Perry or, and I would even argue Romney and others, that we are in danger of that at the tip top of American political power. But what we miss sometimes is how many laws are already on the books, in the legislatures, in Congress. This Fundamentalist 50, these aren't candidates. These are sitting members of the United States Congress. And the way the media works is a lot of times you focus on, Newt Gingrich is the hot guy today. Let's do a story on him because he's running for president, and we watch that horse race. But meanwhile, there are lots of these obscure members of Congress who are incredibly powerful and have been successful in passing laws, and the media doesn't cover that horse race so much. And so it sort of goes under the radar. So I don't know if I'd pick one, but I'll give you an example of one that just kind of, for me, I call it the tinfoil hat award, just because this guy, who's people have usually not heard of, but he's Congressman Steve Pierce. He's from New Mexico. And he really said this. He's talking against gay marriage. And a lot of times, I don't want your listeners to get the wrong impression. In this Fundamentalist 50 chapter, I talk about gay marriage a lot because the politicians are forced, because it's such a hot topic, to talk about gay marriage. But as I show in Chapter 3, there are many, many different types of laws with religious bias. That just happens to be the one that kind of most gets in popular culture. But in this one, he is talking about that issue. And he says there's serious downstream effects, his phrase, to gay marriage. And then he says, and I'm quoting him, they might think to themselves, where they are, I'm going to marry everyone in California with AIDS. Then suddenly they've got access to maybe the benefit program, the health insurance, close quote. Now, I want to break this logic down for you.
Please do. Please do.
I didn't know there was any logic in there to break down. I'm impressed that you're able to find something to begin with.
You've got to sort of think about what this guy's saying. So basically he's saying, if you allowed for marriage equality for gay people, right, then somehow, lickety-split, there's going to be polygamy. I mean, he's sort of implying that basically somehow if you say yes to gay marriage, you got to say yes to polygamy. Which we're hearing this kind of talk. Santorum, I think he talked about, gay marriage and analogized it to, men having sex with animals. I mean, these people are out there. But anyway, back to Pierce. So he says, okay, therefore gay marriage leads to polygamy. Then secondly, apparently, he's perceiving that out in California, they have too generous of healthcare benefits. And that when this person has this polygamous marriage, these darn liberals, they'd say, I'm going to marry a bunch of people with AIDS and give them healthcare. And I like that the disaster at the end of this logic chain is some people with AIDS would have healthcare. Well, to borrow a phrase, God forbid. He's actually serious. That it seems like not only is it so awful that there be gay marriage and then there be polygamy and then you could marry everybody and give them health care, but that somehow giving people health care, that would be an awful result that we wouldn't want to see. And this guy's sitting in Congress. The other one that I often mention is Congressman Shimkus from Illinois. Guy's a chair of a committee, by the way. And this fellow, Illinois, he's downstate, and he basically, in an official hearing of the U.S. House of Representatives, they were talking about the issue of the seas rising resulting from global warming. And he said, well, you don't need to worry about that because in the Bible, it says that there's one flood, Noah's flood, that's it. And so case closed kind of reasoning. And you're thinking, this is a member of the U.S. Congress, and he's talking in an official proceeding about a real serious scientific issue. But yes, he is. And so my point is, this guy isn't somebody who might someday have power. He has power now. In fact, in his case, he's the chair of a committee. And so the one thing I hope folks would take home from the Fundamentalist 50 chapter is how real this is. Let's say, forget it. Let's say that Obama wins in 2012. Let's assume that. I still think even with that today there is a greater threat of real theocracy seeping into this country than ever before. I mean, you look at Obama, this last decision you've seen, or last issue that's bubbled up about the Catholic Church saying their religious liberties are impeded because, and this is really what they say, they don't admit it, but this is what they're saying, in the trafficking cases, human trafficking, where they often bring in women, often girls, who are basically like slaves, and sometimes they're like sex slaves. I mean, it's pretty horrific, horrible stuff. And the Catholic Church says, we want to deny them contraception. That's what they want to do. And they say it's a denial of their religious liberty to deny these victims, some of the most vulnerable people on earth, deny them contraception. I mean, sometimes girls who've been beaten and raped, let's deny them contraception, but yet they go through the looking glass in terms of their reasoning and say, that's denying us religious liberty. And what's scary is apparently the Obama administration, which should be thinking more along our lines, one would hope, is actually considering seriously deferring to the Catholic Church on these issues. I hope they don't, but it's concerning. So that's how bad it's gotten. It's worse than ever since the founding of the Republic.
And you're talking about a few minutes ago, talking about sort of how government interacts with the church. And there's a lot of instances in your book where you talk about religious exemptions and how there's sort of this uneven playing field. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I think it's one of the most important untold stories. It's not just that the politicians are there, it's that the laws are there as well. And even though the hot button ones are sort of abortion, let's say, and gay marriage, and they're important issues, children's law, whether it's the so-called faith healing exemption in child protection, whether it's some states that have religious exemptions in childcare, religious exemptions in vaccines, religious exemptions in corporal punishment, striking children for discipline in schools. There's a whole range in the area of children's law that provide religious exemptions, which are physically, in some cases, harmful to children, which I think is morally abhorrent. Which gets back to your, the story from the study you told at the beginning, is I'm so proud because of all the policy stands I talk about in my book opposing this religious bias. When it comes right down to it, we're on the side of people not getting hurt, of people being treated gently, and a lot of laws that people just aren't aware of. Of course, huge bias in tax law that enriches some of the wealthy mega ministers, lines their pockets for people who go out and preach hate. They get not only the exemption that everybody hears about, tax deductibility for contributions, but they get an exemption for their house that can really be for a palatial type of home, sometimes for multiple ministers within one megachurch. And you think about the hundreds and hundreds, the explosion in megachurches in this country since 1970. There was just a handful of megachurches in 1970. Now they are a huge and growing business. Anything else you name, stem cell research, end-of-life situations, all being restricted by religious bias. In education, dramatic amounts of religious bias. The Texas textbooks that now are sent out all throughout the United States, thus affecting children all over America, unfortunately. Vouchers for religious bias in D.C. that you help subsidize. Religious bias imposed on land use planning. A lot of people would not expect this, but it's actually getting more and more rampant. It's all over the place, and we really need to speak out about it. In the United States military, scandal after scandal where fundamentalism has creeped its way into the U.S. military, and if you're not of a fundamentalist perspective, you're really in large measure at a disadvantage in the United States military today. That's completely against what our founders would have believed. So it's a myriad set of laws. I list them in my book, and my hope is for you folks and for your listeners that it's kind of a toolkit. So when you talk to your neighbors and talk to your friends, you can bring these issues out.
Another thing that I think your book outlines really well, and this is the beginning, you talk about whether or not our nation had a Christian founding. Now, there's some people in the media today, especially on Fox News, especially on Glenn Beck's show, specifically Glenn Beck, who talk about how this nation is a Christian nation, how it was founded. Sarah Palin loves to say how it's a Christian nation. Actually, most of the people that are frontrunners in the GOP currently talk about a Christian nation. I know, I know that there's a bit you go into Ron Paul in your book. He's one of the fundamentalist 50, and you say that he even says that this is a Christian nation. What do you have to say to those people?
They're wrong. And the evidence is overwhelming that they are wrong. I'll just take Madison. I'm a real admirer of Madison. He designed the Constitution more than any other single person. He's called the father of the Constitution in the history books. And let me just give you some quotes from James Madison. One, in no instance have the churches been the guardians of the liberties of the people. Quote two, religious bondage shackles and debilitates the mind and unfits it for every noble enterprise. Quote three, religion has been much oftener a motive to repression than a restraint from it. There's no doubt when you look at particularly what Jefferson and Madison were about, it is a seminal moment, not just in the history of the United States, a seminal moment in the history of the human race, when Jefferson in Virginia, in the state of Virginia, argued for separation of church and state. He actually proposed the concept in the Virginia legislature, and this you see this a lot in this in the pattern in their lives. Madison, the less famous, the less hip, the less cool guy, he went and got it passed, and then nationally, somewhat the same thing. Jefferson is off in Europe, right, at the time of the forming of the Constitution. Madison, who's his right-hand man, his best guy, has really been crafting the Constitution. Jefferson writes back and says, no guarantee of separation of church and state, among other things. And Madison dutifully, after thinking about it, goes back and really works hard to get this Bill of Rights, which, number one, is the Establishment Clause prohibiting establishment of religion. This is unheard of. This is unheard of in the history of the world. It's always been, the king is divine right by God and all the rest of it. And these guys came up with a new idea. And so it is so ironic when these right-wing ideologues start talking about us as a Christian nation, when it is not just an important aspect of our founding. It is in many ways, according to Jefferson, the important aspect of our founding. Jefferson, on his gravestone, did not include that he was the president of the United States. He picked three things. And one of them was the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which is the one providing for separation of church and state. He put that above being president of the United States. This is a pretty accomplished guy. Being president, not enough to make the list. But this he thought was more important. That's how significant. And in some ways, he's got a strong argument, because there's been over 40 presidents, but it was Jefferson with Madison that changed the entire world. And unfortunately, sadly, we're seeing that here this nation was founded on this great step forward is allowing that wall of separation to crumble. And it's sad.
So how does that happen? I guess that's when did this shift occur? Is the thing that I keep thinking about. Clearly it feels obviously political. It feels to me, and I don't know this, but I feel like there had to come a point where the hyper religious folks in this country were seen as a voting demographic, and if we see them, we mobilize them, we join them all together, we can appeal to them en masse, and so we can then get their votes. But it seems like there's been a shift from this sort of hey, let's take advantage of this voting demographic to this voting demographic is now taking advantage of us. This voting demographic has taken control of an entire political party in this country. You cannot You cannot get elected to major Republican office, I don't think, at all. And it's deeply unlikely to get elected to office as a Democrat. But I think it's impossible to get elected to office as a Republican and not hold these strong religious views, or at least espouse these strong religious views if you don't hold them. So when and how did this shift occur?
Well, first of all, you're right. It's never happened like this in America, where essentially a particular religious viewpoint has veto power over one of two major political parties. It's huge. It's historic. And in some ways, you got to tip your hat to the religious right because, despite the phrase moral majority, they've never been moral and they've never been the majority.
Details.
They have bootstrapped their way, and you got to give them credit. I mean, Barry Goldwater, the Mr. Conservative back in the 60s, in some people's minds, the founder of modern conservatism, couldn't get elected. He could not get the nomination because of the very directly hostile things that he says, and I quote in my book, because he represented the true libertarian perspective, and he couldn't get elected, certainly couldn't get the nomination today because he said so many directly hostile things that I quote in my book about the religious right. So it is an unprecedented time. And I give credit to the religious right because back in the 60s and 70s, I think they looked around, didn't like what they saw, and they organized. And they were successful running people for the school board, the city council, and getting involved in Republican primaries. A key pivot point was 1980, August of 1980. Reagan had just secured the Republican nomination. And a group that had, to that point, been ignored, or in recent years been ignored, they held a big convention in Dallas, Texas. And Jerry Falwell organized it of fundamentalist ministers. And Reagan goes before this group and, cognizant of the law that the ministers can endorse from the pulpit, Ronald Reagan says, and I'm paraphrasing, but I'm pretty close to the accurate quote here. He said, "I know you can't endorse me, but I can endorse you." And he specifically opened the doors of the Republican Party to religious right influence, and ultimately the point where we're at now, where essentially it's like a veto power. And one of the things that I see as critical in what I write about in my book is we need a business plan. Whatever else you say about the religious right, they had a plan, a grassroots plan, and they organized. It's not enough for secular people to say, well, I disagree. No, we need to organize and have a business plan. My book offers a business plan and offers a 10-point vision of a secular America. We need to organize and galvanize, and that's what those different chapters in my book do.
You mentioned your 10-point vision. Can you explain just briefly what that means?
I won't belabor people with each point in the 10-point vision, but the secular movement needs to have a real effect on society. And so in addition to the business plan, it's called Our Secular Decade that I lay out in the book, and that I'm going to work for now as Director of Strategy and Policy for the Richard Dawkins Foundation. We need a vision that can help unite, energize, and galvanize people. And I encourage your listeners, you can just go to YouTube or go to the Dawkins site, but there's a speech on YouTube. I think it says Sean Faircloth introduces Richard Dawkins. We'll get you to it. And I lay out the 10-point vision there. And the point is, in each of these 10 types of laws, and they're not really laws, but sort of a vision of what America will be, they all demonstrate one uniting thread. And that is that we are the ones being inclusive. We are the ones being compassionate, not just compassionate to ourselves, but compassion to children in fundamentalist homes that are human beings like anyone else, that don't deserve to suffer under faith healing, don't deserve to be beaten. We speak out for the human rights of all people uniformly. And that's what's so great about our vision. And the 10-point vision kind of crystallizes it. And so I'd encourage your viewers to look for that. And I think it's something that we can use as another tool in the toolkit to sort of bring it out to our friends. It's not just about, oh, there's the cranky atheist against the cross on public land and a hill. Now, as a lawyer, I'm against that because as a matter of constitutional principle, that's not an appropriate use of public land. But I'm a politician enough to know I don't think that's going to galvanize our neighbors and friends. The 10-point vision offers a positive and optimistic view of the future, and I encourage your listeners to check that out.
So which step is to have a bitchy podcast? I guess that's – I didn't notice that.
That is critically important.
We're glad you endorse us here, Sean. So Tom and I think I speak for Tom when I say we both really enjoyed the book. We thought it really did a good job of outlining everything you talked about. You're going to be going on a book tour here. I know people can find out more information at richarddawkins.net. Is there any other place you want to send them on the web?
Well, check out some of my talks. I do have a talk about the book on YouTube, Sean Faircloth, Attack of the Theocrats. Although I'd say looking at my talk, Sean Faircloth introduces Richard Dawkins. I think it's at Lynchburg, Virginia, where I enjoy laying into Liberty University, by the way. Gives a quick overview of some of what I'm talking about. And then I hope people will check out the book because it really is, it's a blueprint. It's a business plan for us. We can either sit by the sidelines or we can make America a better place. And I think not only should secular people make America a better place, we should lead making America a better place. And that's what Attack of the Theocrats is all about.
Sean, we're going to actually link to your video. I see it directly on Richard Dawkins' site, so I'm actually going to put it directly in the show notes here. So if any of the listeners want to see it, it's going to be in the show notes for this particular episode. Sean, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Great talking to you.